Hello there, Oskar from Virtual Factually here. Now today we're going to continue our closer look at Lecture's Hauptstücke by examining Nachraysen. Nachraysen is really one of the more important Hauptstücke in my opinion, because the advice you get from this particular Hauptstück is really fundamental in any type of fencing and will serve you really well in Messer specifically. As usual, I'll first explain why I think this Hauptstück is there, so what's its function. And then I'll give a quick overview of all the plays that are there, and then finally I'll give you a couple of practical pointers if you want to get started on using Nachraysen yourself. Nachraysen is pretty much the first Hauptstück that will allow us to solve a particular type of problem that's presented by an opponent that doesn't really do fencing all that well. They make a certain type of mistake or they display a certain type of behavior that good fencing is not really designed to counter. So we do something else that's specifically designed to counter our opponent's action or solve this tactical problem, so you will. And Nachraysen pretty much is what we should be doing if our opponent is moving towards us without actually creating a sort of credible threat. That can be, for instance, when they cut in front of us. They make a cut and it misses. Or it can be that they make these huge strikes around their head while it should be smaller movements and a lot tighter. Or it could be, for instance, that they make an attack but don't really commit to it enough, pretty much missing their attack. In all these cases, you should immediately go forward and grab the opportunity that's handed to you on a silver platter and get that free striking. That is pretty much what Nachraysen is supposed to do. With regards to what kind of plays are there, of course there's the basic Nachraysen. Pretty much it's the setup, someone makes an Obenhau at you and they miss, or you make them miss the Obenhau and immediately cut after with Nachraysen, as you can see here. Immediately following that, of course, there's the plays that demonstrate to you how you can use the Nachraysen to get into a winding again. And the most obvious one is, of course, to make an Entrüsthau if your Nachraysen is parried. But of course you can also thrust from there and even slice, because you have the famous slice across the mouth, the Schnittdurchmaul, which you can see here. The next set of plays really shows us how to use the principle of Nachraysen in other situations. For instance, if we're in Bastei and someone tries to bind down on the Messer, not really creating a threat towards us, we should simply pretty much remove the Messer and attack them elsewhere. More interesting, for instance, situations I described earlier, when you are bound with your opponent and they pull away the blade and try to make a huge cut around. You get a lot of free time and a lot of free real estate to just get a free cut in before you step away and parry. And finally, when someone tries to get in a leg shot but does this poorly by kind of bending over, you can instantly punish that by doing a Nachraysen, because if they kind of bend over like that or want to bend backwards on their retreat, they don't really have their center of mass over their legs, and therefore they're going to be a lot slower on their legs, giving you a lot of free time to get your Nachraysen in. The final set of plays in Nachraysen pretty much gives you some sort of expanded counterplay. What if you perform Nachraysen but your opponent parries with a hanging parry? Now, then you can do something against that, and they will have the option to work against that as well, and then finally you can bring in a counter again. Now, this is pretty interesting. This is very much unlike early Kunst des Fechten tradition manuscripts, but you will see that much more, for instance, in Paulus Hector Meyer, these compound plays rather. It doesn't happen often in Leicester, but this is one of those plays where it is the case. So, I think I've made it pretty clear that Nachraysen is a really useful Hauptstück to have some knowledge and practical experience of. But how do you get this practical experience? What do you need to keep in mind when practicing Nachraysen? Now, the first thing is whether to step back or not when you are waiting for the attack to miss. Now, there's a bit of a debate on this, whether the text implies that the attack should just miss and only then should you use Nachraysen. But the text pretty much says make sure that their attack misses you. And to make sure can also mean that you take a slight step back, just to make sure. It's, of course, it works best when someone just completely misses their attack and you jump in the opening that's created, but sometimes this can be a hit or miss, quite literally. Sometimes it's really difficult to judge whether an attack is going to reach you or not. And in those cases, really, I would recommend taking a slight shuffle back, just to be sure. Now, there's another thing that is very important to keep in mind though, and that is pretty much as soon as the blade is past you, you should start to go forward. Go forward as soon as you can be sure that you're not actually walking into the strike, but no later than that. If you try and do a Nachraysen after your opponent has already finished their cut, you're giving them plenty of time to parry, or even just set up a perfectly good counter, like an absatz or something. Avoid that and do your Nachraysen pretty much as soon as their blade has passed you. Another thing to keep in mind is that I think Nachraysen is meant as a pretty linear play footwork-wise. You can imagine that if someone attacks you, they miss, they will probably start to retreat really quickly and just try to get the hell out of there. And if you want to do Nachraysen, you should probably gain quite a lot of distance to make sure that you can actually hit them. And the footwork supports this. So what it pretty much says is that you should jump forward, and to jump means that both your feet leave the ground. Ideally, I'd like to start with the left leg in front, and then jump forward with the right leg, pushing off with my left leg for the last bit. And it doesn't really matter whether I cut from the left or right here, because with Messer it generally doesn't matter which foot is in front. You can just as easily cut from the right and from the left. Now finally, there's an interesting thing to note. I'm not sure if this is there in longsword, but I think Nachraysen is really explicit about this, is that you should be cutting through the same line as your opponent's cut. So if your opponent's cut comes in towards your left side, towards your left shoulder, then you should cut from your left side. And if they come towards your right side, you should cut from your right side. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that this limits the options that your opponent has for their parry. If you cut across from their original attack, the parry is going to be pretty easy. You just like recover slightly and just raise the blade in a simple parry. However, if you cut in the same line as their original attack, that means that their parry needs to be some sort of a hanging parry. That's literally the only option they have from the place where they can start recovering from their original cut. And that is interesting because the expanded counterplays that I showed you earlier pretty much start when your opponent parries with a hanging parry, pretty much. I hope you find these tips useful, and I hope that you'll be able to start using them to incorporate Nachraysen a little bit more often in your Messer fencing. I think it's a very useful Hauptstück to have at your disposal, especially against people who are more used to fencing with different types of weapons, such as sabers. They might not really look for the bind as much as Messer fencers, try to go for a bit more parry riposte style of fencing, and that means that the cuts tend to be somewhat committed and the footwork is slightly more linear. Well, you can use Nachraysen really there to either play that game and win it, or you can use it to play that game but then transition into the windings that you should be much more comfortable with as a Messer fencer. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave me a comment to let me know what you think. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment as well. And don't forget to like it and subscribe if you haven't already. And finally, a heartfelt thank you to my patrons. You all rock. Thanks. Anyway, keep safe, keep fencing, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.